Today is August the 8th. Can I play around with sin? Let's find out together as we study Judges 1 to 3. We're reading through the Bible in a year in a little bit different setting here this morning. I'd like you to read today Judges 1 to 3. Now, in the book of Judges, we have the beginning of the Iron Age. The Iron Age has been around for maybe 200-300 years by this time. The entire book of Judges takes place after the Exodus from Egypt and just before Saul and David are named kings. So it's somewhere in that 1400 to 1000 before Christ age. The thing that I hope you noticed as you read through Judges chapter 1 was the repetition that comes up several times. Look, for example, Judges 1:19. The Lord is with the people of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they failed to drive out the people living in the plains, who had iron chariots. Verse 27, the tribe of Manasseh failed to drive out the people living in, and they name several major towns. 29, the tribe of Ephraim failed to drive out the Canaanites. Verse 30, every single verse after this, the tribe of Zebulun failed to drive out the residents. Verse 31, the tribe of Asher failed to drive out the residents. Verse 33, the tribe of Naphtali failed to drive out the residents. Now the Lord had asked them to drive out the residents of the land, but instead we have chapter 1, verse 32. The people of Asher moved in among the Canaanites, who controlled the land, for they failed to drive them out. And then later on in verse 34, as for the tribe of Dan, the Amorites forced them back into the hill country. Not only did Dan fail to drive out the residents repelled them. So we see here a series of shortcomings on behalf of the tribes. Chapter 2, the first 6 verses, tells the story of an angel that comes from the Lord and weeps. He comes to a place that they call Bokim. That means weeping. And he says, you have failed to drive out the residents of the land. So look at what God says in verse 3 of chapter 2. Now I declare that I will no longer drive out the people living in your land. There'll be thorns in your side. Their gods will be a constant temptation to you. As we move on through chapter 2, from verses 10 to the end of that chapter, begins to tell us it summarizes what happens in Israel after this. There is a cycle that Israel repeats 12 times. Israel worships the gods of the land, Baal primarily. Secondly, God becomes angry and he sends an oppressor to Israel. Third, Israel cries out to the Lord for help. After all, they do know that God is their God. He is who they go to for help. 4, God sends a judge to deliver them. The judge is not a man who determines who is right and who is wrong according to the law. The judge executes God's justice on the people. And then 5th, when that judge eventually dies, Israel worships Baal. Now in chapter 3, we have the first 3 judges that are mentioned, Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. Just as an example, let's look at Othniel. 3:7, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot about the Lord their God, and they served the images of Baal and the Asherah poles. Israel follows other gods. The second point, God becomes angry. In verse 8, the Lord burned with anger. He turned them over to King Cushan Rishathaim. There is the oppressor. 3, Israel cries to the Lord for help. Verse 9, but when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, God sends a judge. His name was Othniel. And in verse 11, after Othniel defeats the oppressor, there was peace in the land for 40 years, and Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. Verse 12, once again the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. So there are those 5 elements. We started today's devotional with the question, can I play around with sin? You know, Israel tried to. Israel tried to follow the Lord, but only half-heartedly. They could not play around with sin. Neither can we. Like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Email your questions to us at questions@becomehope.com. Tomorrow, we'll answer the question, how did Israel confront a technologically superior army?